A disabled veteran in a wheelchair approached the royal guard, expecting nothing more than a quiet moment of respect. But when the guard did something completely unexpected, the entire crowd fell silent. Here's what happened. Before we continue, let us know in the comments below where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow at the same time we'll bring you another incredible story showcasing the bravery and discipline of the Royal Guard. You won't want to miss it. The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Buckingham Palace as James Cooper wheeled himself along the familiar path, each turn of his chair's wheels measured and deliberate. At 62, his arms had grown accustomed to this daily routine, muscles developed over 15 years of adapting to life without the use of his legs. His Royal Marines dress uniform, preserved with meticulous care despite the years since his service, sat crisp and dignified on his frame. Another beautiful morning in London, he murmured to himself, adjusting the medals that gleamed on his chest. Decorations earned in conflicts that many of the young tourists around him had only read about in history books. The Victoria Cross among them caught the early light, its bronze patina telling stories of valour that James rarely spoke of anymore. The crowd was already gathering, their excited chatter floating on the morning breeze as they positioned themselves for the perfect photo opportunity. James observed them with the quiet patience of a man who had learned to see beauty in life's slower moments. Children pointed at the palace guards, their parents trying to explain the significance of these sentinels of tradition, while couples posed for pictures against the backdrop of royal grandeur. But James wasn't here for photos. His weathered hands gripped his wheelchair's rims with renewed purpose as he made his way closer to the guard post. 15 years had passed since the IED in Helmand province had taken his legs, but his military bearing remained unchanged, shoulders square, chin high, eyes alert. The chair might have changed how he moved, but it hadn't touched the soldier within. "Excuse me, sir," a young mother gently guided her curious child aside, her eyes widening slightly as she noticed James's decorations. The respect in her gaze was immediate, instinctive, the kind of recognition that transcended nationality or age. James nodded his thanks, a small smile touching the corners of his mouth. The morning air carried the crispness of early autumn, rustling the leaves of nearby trees and adding a subtle sway to the guard's bearskin cap in the distance. As James drew closer to the guard post, his fingers unconsciously brushed against his own cap, secured carefully to his lap. The familiar texture of the fabric brought back memories of standing guard himself, years ago, before Afghanistan had rewritten his story. After all these years, he thought, positioning his chair with precision that spoke of his military background, some things never change. The guard stood perfectly still, a living embodiment of the discipline James knew so well. But there was something else in the air this morning, something that made James's heart beat a little faster beneath his medals. Today wasn't just another visit to reminisce about his service days. Today, James Cooper had made a decision. His hands gripped his wheelchair's arms tighter, knuckles whitening slightly as he steeled himself for what was to come. The crowd continued to mill around him, but he barely noticed them now. His focus had narrowed to the guard post ahead, to the moment he had been building towards since dawn. The morning sun climbed higher, casting its golden light across the palace grounds as James took a deep breath. Some battles, he had learned, weren't fought with weapons or won with strategy. Some required a different kind of courage altogether. Private William Harrison stood at his post with the perfect stillness that had become second nature after 3 years with the Queen's Guard. At 28, he carried himself with the gravity of someone who understood the true weight of the uniform he wore. Each brass button, every precise crease, told stories of dedication that went far beyond ceremonial duty. His path to this position had been shaped by generations of service. His grandfather had fought at Normandy, his father in the Falklands, and Harrison himself had seen 2 tours in Afghanistan before earning his place among the elite guardsmen. The family legacy of service ran as deep as the foundations of Buckingham Palace itself, But it was more than just family tradition that kept Harrison's posture parade ground perfect as the morning sun warmed his scarlet tunic. His own experiences in Helmand Province had taught him the true meaning of the uniform he now wore. He could still recall the weight of his combat gear, the taste of desert dust, and the brotherhood forged in moments when ceremony gave way to survival. Your ceremonial duties are just as important as your combat service, his commanding officer had told him during his guard training. You're not just standing watch, you're guarding centuries of tradition, honor, and sacrifice. Those words had resonated with Harrison, especially after what he'd witnessed in Afghanistan. He remembered the disabled veterans he'd helped evacuate under heavy fire, the wounded comrades he'd carried to safety, the moments when duty meant putting everything on the line. Each morning, as he donned his ceremonial uniform, he thought of them, the ones who had given parts of themselves in service of something greater. The morning crowd ebbed and flowed around his post, but Harrison's focus remained unwavering. His eyes, fixed straight ahead as protocol demanded, held the steady gaze of someone who had seen both the pageantry and the harsh realities of military service. Every tourist photo, every attempted joke, every passerby's comment was met with the same disciplined silence. Through his peripheral vision, Harrison had begun to notice the wheelchair approaching, its occupant's military bearing unmistakable even before the medals came into view. Something in the veteran's presence stirred memories of Harrison's own service, of the men and women he'd served alongside, of the sacrifices he'd witnessed, of the cost of the freedom this palace represented. The Victoria Cross on the veteran's chest caught Harrison's attention. Not that he allowed his eyes to move, but he knew its significance. In his 3 years standing guard, he'd seen countless medals, but the VC was different. It spoke of valor beyond duty, of sacrifice beyond service, of moments when protocol gave way to raw courage. Harrison's own chest carried decorations from his tours, medals that marked him as more than just a ceremonial guard. But seeing the VC stirred something deeper, a recognition of the highest level of sacrifice and bravery. His grandfather had served alongside VC recipients, and the stories he'd told had shaped Harrison's understanding of true heroism. As the veteran drew closer, Harrison maintained his statue-like stance, but his mind was active. Years of military service had taught him to observe everything while appearing to notice nothing. He could see the veteran's preserved military bearing, the way he handled his wheelchair with the same precision Harrison brought to his guard duties. Every detail spoke of a lifetime of service, of sacrifices made and honours earned. James Cooper positioned his wheelchair with military precision, exactly 3 paces from where Guard Harrison stood at attention. The morning crowd parted naturally around them, perhaps sensing the unspoken connection between the two servicemen. Though neither spoke nor made eye contact, the air between them crackled with mutual recognition. The silent acknowledgement that exists only between those who have worn the uniform. Cooper's hands rested quietly on his wheelchair's arms, his posture as correct as Harrison's despite his seated position. His Victoria Cross caught the strengthening sunlight, its modest bronze surface carrying more weight than all the palace's gilt and gold. A young boy nearby pointed at the medal, tugging at his father's sleeve with questions, but his father gently guided him away, recognizing the solemnity of the moment unfolding. The guard's shadow fell across Cooper's wheelchair as the sun climbed higher, creating a tableau that caused several passers-by to lower their cameras respectfully. There was something in the scene that didn't belong in tourist photos. A dignity that transcended the usual palace pageantry. 2 soldiers, separated by years and circumstance, bound by something deeper than ceremony. Cooper's weathered fingers traced the arm of his wheelchair, remembering the weight of his rifle from his own guard duty days. Though decades had passed, muscle memory remained. The perfect stance, the measured breathing, the absolute stillness that the position demanded. His eyes, focused straight ahead just as Harrison's were, saw not the palace walls but through them, back to his own time standing watch. A subtle breeze stirred the guard's bearskin cap, carrying with it the familiar London morning smells, stone and history and the promise of rain. Cooper inhaled deeply, his chest expanding against his perfectly pressed uniform. The medals clinked softly, a sound almost lost in the general murmur of the crowd, but one that seemed to hang in the air between him and Harrison. Other veterans in the crowd had begun to notice, drawing closer with the quiet respect of those who understood. They saw what the tourists couldn't: the mirrored military bearing, the shared understanding of duty, the weight of service evident in both men's posture. A former RAF pilot, his own service obvious in his bearing, touched his wife's arm and nodded toward the scene, words unnecessary. Minutes passed, marked only by the steady London traffic in the distance and the soft shuffling of tourist feet. Cooper remained as still as Harrison, two statues amid the flowing crowd, each lost in thoughts of service and sacrifice. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the medals on both men's chests, decorations that spoke of battles fought, comrades lost, and duties fulfilled. An elderly couple paused nearby, the husband leaning heavily on his cane. His campaign medals from a different era caught the light, adding another layer to the silent communion taking place. He studied the scene before him with knowing eyes, perhaps seeing himself in both men. The standing guard he had once been, the disabled veteran he had become. Cooper's hands tightened slightly on his wheelchair's arms, the only outward sign of the emotions running beneath his composed surface. Each breath carried the weight of memories, the pride of standing guard in his youth, the searing moment in Helmand that had changed everything, the long journey that had brought him here to this moment, facing another young guard who might have been himself decades ago. Harrison, though his eyes remained fixed ahead, was acutely aware of Cooper's presence. Years of military service had honed his peripheral vision, allowing him to observe while appearing to stare straight ahead. He noted the veteran's perfect posture, the precision with which he had positioned his wheelchair, the quiet dignity that spoke of decades of service. Though protocol prevented any acknowledgement, respect radiated from his rigid stance. The crowd had thinned around them, creating an unconscious circle of space that seemed to recognize the gravity of the moment. Even the ever-present London pigeons seemed to give the scene a respectful birth, as if sensing that this small patch of ground had become hallowed by the silent communion taking place upon it. A church bell tolled in the distance, its deep notes rolling across the palace grounds like distant thunder. The moment began with a subtle shift in Cooper's posture, a gathering of resolve visible only to those who understood the language of military bearing. His hands moved from his medals to grip the wheelchair's arms with renewed purpose, knuckles whitening with determination. "Time to stand one last time," he whispered, his voice carrying no further than his own ears. The words were a prayer, a challenge, a decision 15 years in the making. Though his legs had long since betrayed him, his warrior's spirit remained unbroken. With painstaking effort, Cooper began to push himself upward. His arms, strengthened by years of adapting to life without the use of his legs, trembled with the strain. The wheelchair creaked softly as he shifted his weight, preparing for what many would consider impossible. The first signs of movement drew the crowd's attention. The earlier respectful distance transformed into breathless anticipation as people began to realize what was happening. A former Royal Marine in the crowd took an instinctive step forward, ready to assist, but something in Cooper's bearing kept him back. This was a battle that needed to be fought alone. Inch by determined inch, Cooper raised himself from the wheelchair. His perfectly pressed uniform stretched across shoulders that refused to bow to the weight of years and injury. The medals on his chest caught the sunlight, seeming to glow with their own inner fire as he fought against gravity and circumstance. Harrison, still maintaining his guard position, felt every moment of Cooper's struggle through his peripheral vision. The young guard's training warred with his instincts, every fibre of his being wanting to break position to help a fellow soldier in need. His fingers tightened imperceptibly on his rifle, the only outward sign of his internal conflict. Cooper's breath came in controlled bursts now, each one measured and purposeful. His arms shook with the effort of supporting his entire weight, but his face remained composed, the same expression he'd worn while standing guard decades ago, the same one he'd maintained through firefights and the explosion that had taken his legs. "God save the king," he murmured through gritted teeth, using the words as a mantra to push through the pain. His legs, useless for 15 years, hung beneath him as he supported himself entirely with his upper body strength. Yet somehow, through sheer force of will, he was rising. The crowd had gone completely silent. Parents lifted children to see, explaining in hushed whispers the significance of what they were witnessing. The former RAF pilot removed his cap, holding it over his heart. His wife wiped tears from her eyes, understanding the magnitude of this moment. Cooper's torso was fully vertical now, his arms locked as he held himself up from his wheelchair. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but his military bearing never wavered. In this moment, he was no longer a disabled veteran. He was once again the young guard who had stood watch over these same grounds, who had served with pride, who had given everything for the uniform he wore. And then it happened. Guard Harrison, in a motion as crisp as any drill movement, broke his stance. His head turned, eyes meeting Cooper's for the first time. In that shared gaze, past decades of service, sacrifice, and understanding, without hesitation, Harrison's rifle snapped to his shoulder, and his white-gloved hand rose in a perfect salute. The sound of his boots pivoting echoed across the suddenly silent courtyard. This was no ceremonial gesture. It was one soldier honouring another, protocol giving way to something far more profound. Harrison's salute spoke volumes. Recognition of sacrifice, acknowledgement of courage, respect from one generation of warriors to another. Cooper, still supporting himself with trembling arms, returned the salute. His motion was perfect, drilled into muscle memory through years of service. The Victoria Cross on his chest seemed to blaze in the morning sun, a bronze testament to the kind of courage that was once again on display. Tears streamed freely down the faces of veterans in the crowd. A young mother lifted her phone to capture the moment, then slowly lowered it, realizing some things were too sacred for photographs. The former Marine who had stepped forward earlier stood at attention, offering his own salute to both men. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the two soldiers held their salutes, the young guard in his pristine ceremonial uniform, and the veteran defying his broken body to stand one more time. The very air seemed to vibrate with the weight of tradition, honour, and shared sacrifice that passed between them. Cooper's arms began to shake more violently, but his salute never wavered. His face remained composed, though beads of sweat now ran freely down his temples. The effort was immense, but in his eyes shone the same determination that had earned him the Victoria Cross, the unwavering courage to do what must be done, regardless of the cost. As Cooper's strength finally began to fade, Harrison broke protocol once more. In 2 precise steps, he moved from his post to the veteran's side, his white-gloved hands providing steady support as Cooper lowered himself back into his wheelchair. The movement was smooth, dignified. One soldier assisting another with the same precision used in ceremonial drill. "Thank you, son," Cooper said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of years and memories. His weathered hand came to rest on Harrison's arm for a moment, the touch bridging generations of service. 30 years ago, I stood where you stand now." Harrison's response was equally soft, meant only for Cooper's ears. "The honour is mine, sir." His eyes flickered to the Victoria Cross. "We all stand on the shoulders of giants." The words were simple, but carried the deep understanding of one soldier to another. The former Marine who had watched the scene unfold stepped forward now, his own service medals catching the morning light. "Captain James Cooper," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was there that day in Helmand. When you—" He paused, gathering himself. "When you went back for those civilians under heavy fire, even after the first explosion took your legs." Cooper's hand moved unconsciously to his Victoria Cross. "Just did what any of us would have done, Richard." He looked up, recognition dawning in his eyes. "Lieutenant Wallace, you were there too." Harrison stood at ease now, protocol forgotten in this moment of shared history. Other veterans in the crowd had drawn closer, forming a protective circle around the scene. Each face showed the same understanding, the knowledge that they were witnessing something rare and precious. "3 trips you made," Wallace continued, addressing Harrison as much as the crowd. 3 trips back into that killing zone, dragging civilians to safety. No legs, half-conscious from blood loss. Still you kept going back. His voice cracked slightly. "They don't make VCs for anything less." Cooper's eyes remained steady, though his hand gripped his wheelchair's arm tighter. "We all did our duty," he said simply, "just as this young man does his." He nodded toward Harrison. "Standing guard isn't just about staying still. It's about standing for something." An elderly veteran made his way forward, leaning on his cane. His chest bore campaign medals from conflicts long past. "I served in the Guard in '62, he said, his voice quavering but proud. "Saw my share of combat later, but I never witnessed anything finer than what I've seen here today." Harrison had resumed his position slightly behind Cooper's wheelchair, his bearing still perfectly military, though his post stood empty. Something in his stance suggested he had found a new position to guard, not a fixed point on the palace grounds, but the living embodiment of sacrifice before him. "The uniform changes," Cooper said, addressing the gathered veterans, but speaking to all who could hear. "The battles change, but the duty remains the same." His hand brushed his medals again. "We stand guard over our country, our values, our people. Sometimes standing guard means standing still. Sometimes it means crawling through fire to save others. Sometimes—" He looked up at Harrison with understanding. "It means knowing when to break position to honour what truly matters." The morning sun had fully cleared the palace walls now, bathing the gathered soldiers in golden light. Each medal, each badge of rank, each campaign ribbon told its own story of service and sacrifice. But it was the unspoken understanding between them that truly shone. The brotherhood that transcended rank and time. "You did us proud today, son," the elderly veteran said to Harrison. "Sometimes the truest duty lies in knowing when to break the rules." His gaze swept the gathered faces. "We all learned that lesson in our own ways, didn't we?" Cooper straightened in his wheelchair, his bearing once again perfectly military. "Carry on, Guard Harrison," he said formally, though his eyes conveyed much more. "You have your post to mind." Harrison snapped it to attention, executed a perfect salute that encompassed all the veterans present, then marched back to his position. Each step was measured, precise, but somehow different now. He had always understood what he was guarding, but now he had felt it, lived it, in a way no training could provide. The gathered veterans began to disperse, each offering a quiet word or nod to Cooper as they moved away. Their departure carried the solemnity of soldiers leaving a battlefield, each forever changed by what they had witnessed. Wallace lingered a moment longer, his hand resting briefly on Cooper's shoulder, before he too melted into the growing crowd of tourists. Cooper remained in place, his wheelchair positioned exactly where he had made his stand. His eyes met Harrison's once more, guard and veteran, present and past, linked by understanding deeper than words. The morning light caught both their medals, casting small rainbows on the palace stones. Every morning, Cooper spoke softly, though Harrison's position had resumed its ceremonial stillness, I see young men and women wearing that uniform, standing guard over more than just these walls. His hands smoothed his own uniform, still perfect despite his exertion. Today, you proved why that post matters more than ever. With practiced ease, Cooper turned his wheelchair, preparing to depart. But before he moved away, he sat perfectly straight, offering one final salute, not just to Harrison, but to every guard who had ever stood that post, to every soldier who had ever answered the call of duty. The sun had risen fully now, warming the palace grounds and casting long shadows behind both men. Cooper's shadow stretched behind him, like a memory of the soldier he had been, standing tall and strong. Harrison's shadow merged with it, past and present, becoming one on the ancient stones. As Cooper wheeled himself away, his bearing remained as military as it had been in his guard days. The Victoria Cross caught the light one final time, winking like a star against his chest. He moved through the parting crowd with quiet dignity, leaving behind something more valuable than any medal, a lesson in what it truly means to stand guard over honour, tradition, and respect. Harrison maintained his post with renewed purpose, his eyes fixed ahead, but his understanding forever deepened. He had broken protocol, yes, but in doing so had upheld something far more important. Each tourist that passed now seemed to sense the difference, showing more respect, perhaps understanding that they were seeing more than just a man in a ceremonial uniform. The morning continued its usual rhythm. Tourists came and went, cameras flashed, children pointed and whispered. But something had changed in that small patch of ground before Buckingham Palace. Two soldiers, separated by decades but united in service, had reminded everyone present that true strength isn't found in standing still, but in standing for something. And if anyone looked closely at Guard Harrison for the rest of his watch, they might have noticed that his bearing, always perfect, now carried something more, the quiet pride of a soldier who had learned firsthand why he stood his post, and what it truly meant to guard not just a palace, but the very values that made it worth guarding. What would you have done in Guard Harrison's position? When does following protocol matter less than following your heart? Share your thoughts in the comments below. This story reminds us that sometimes the most powerful moments come from knowing when to break the rules for something greater. Have you ever witnessed a moment where duty and humanity intersected in such a profound way? If this story touched your heart, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about the men and women who stand guard over our traditions and values. Hit that bell icon to make sure you never miss our latest uploads. Check out our other stories appearing on your screen right now. Until next time, remember, true strength isn't just about standing still, it's about standing for something. We'll see you in the next story.